Okay, time to start our Bible study. If you'd like, go ahead and open up your Bibles to Acts chapter 10. Acts chapter 10, we're going to be getting into the main part of the class. Whenever we do a little bit of a review, then we'll jump over and get into the actual text of Acts chapter 10. So I'm glad you're joining us. I do have Haynes. Good to see you guys join us this morning. Brother and Sister Haynes with us this morning. And if you're with us and I hope that you would get involved and add comments, thoughts. It's really wonderful to be able to have that participation from not only within the class here, but also online. Before we continue, let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. Our most gracious and loving Father, thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity we have to study your word. We pray, Father, that as we do so, we would be able to put away the things that have been kind of distracting us. We'd be able to think upon the scriptures that we're reading, and that we would be able to come to the right understanding. And ultimately, Father, we hope that we'd be able to make that word and wisdom shape us differently and improve our spirit so that we could live a life that is fuller and a reflection of your grace and your love. We ask all this in Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so last week we looked at the shift between the change from Saul's conversion, and after Saul become a Christian, and then after he went up to Jerusalem, and at Jerusalem, basically death threats. Damascus, they had to lower him out of a basket to get him out of town because he was going to be killed. Then gets to Jerusalem, he's really cold shoulder reception-wise. And then at the same thing, I mean, Paul is on fire. I mean, he did not take a sabbatical to rest and get studied up and then start preaching. You see, he just fired off right away and started going with the same fervent spirit that he had in persecuting the church. We see it now. But at that time, we see that there's a little low spot in the persecution of the church. And because the reading leader's gone. Saul's no longer the main person that is persecuting. So there's a lull there in that activity of persecution. And then Luke switches over and goes to Peter. And so in Peter, we see the Western ministry, which is kind of Joppa. And he comes over to the Lydda, and some miracles that occur there that we looked at last week. We saw, and this is just kind of a summation of what we were looking at last week in the basic geographical area. Kind of swinging up to the left there, we're seeing the gospel move, but it's still staying within the Jewish culture. It's not reached really beyond. And I said that loosely, and I kind of paused because we already know that Philip has taken the word to the Samaritans. But the Samaritans were considered Jewish, but they were not a pure breed because of the I guess you call it the captivity that they went off into, and half of them stayed behind. They never really returned. So they intermarried with a lot of the people from around that area, and they've lost their traditional customs and a lot of the things. And they weren't respected by the Jews that returned from captivity in Babylon. But they still worshiped God. They worshiped him in the wrong location, and they had many other things that they had perverted away from the Judaism and Mosaic law. So now they were never really accepted. But it's interesting, the Samaritans do receive the word. There are Christians there. But this is a shift that we're going to see, a big shift, and also a fulfillment of this prophecy that God has already said from the beginning of time about bringing in this gospel message. The first healing was from a man that had been bedridden for 8 years, and that very obviously was not able to get up and to move at all. And that healing then, while he was there, we find that it says members of the church in verse 36, when we start to pick up the story of Dorcas, that members, disciples in Joppa had heard Peter was there, so they send for him. He comes there, and we find out Tabitha is the Aramaic name. That's her name Aramaically. And then Dorcas is the Greek. So that's why he uses the word Dorcas, because it's written in Greek, same name. But he's there, and we find out that this is a woman of great faith, great works. The people are mourning, and the healing was taking place in an upper room upstairs. Peter does it in privacy. He sends out everybody away from them, and he kneels down and he prays. And then after he prays, this is something that I thought was really important in a way, the way Peter then commands her. He commands her to arise. And, he just asked God, and I'm sure part of that prayer was to bring her back, but then he had to say it, and then she did. So it was Peter. And I think these are events as well that's helping Peter to build up his understanding of the power that he has and the faith that he has, and bringing and building him up spiritually as well. Many times our faith is built, we're accomplishing things, but when we see the power of it and the success of it, it really helps us to build ourselves up, and we learn a lot about ourselves. And while he's staying in Joppa, this is where Luke kind of goes away from Peter in Joppa, staying with Simon the tanner, and now shifts up and tells us about this man Cornelius. So let's go ahead and read this first verses about it, 1 through 8. At Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of what is known as the Italian cohort, a devout man who feared God with all his household, gave alms generously to the people, and prayed continually to God. About the 9th hour of the day, he saw clearly in a vision an angel of God come in and say to him, "Cornelius." And he stared at him in a terror, and he said, "What is it, Lord?" And he said to him, "Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. And now send men to Joppa and bring one Simon, who is called Peter. He is lodged with one Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the sea." When the angel who spoke to him had departed, he called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier from among those who attend him. And having related everything to them, he sent them to Joppa. So there's a lot of things that we see initially about just this man Cornelius. And I know that this is one of the great conversion stories, but it's also a very important historical point with Christianity, because it's really truly the first Gentile that is going to be blessed with becoming a Christian. Today, we have people from all races, cultures, just, becoming Christians all the time. But it has not gone to a pure Gentile. There may have been some, like I said, the Samaritans, they were sort of faithful, but genealogically, they were kind of attached to the seed of Abraham and some of the promises there. We see Jesus as well, showing the Samaritans some favor, and the woman at the well staying in Samaria. So there was still a relationship with the Jews and the Samaritans. It was a whole lot better and respected a little bit better than just a Gentile. A Gentile was a very unclean cultural person, a person that was spiritually not to be associated with at all. You remember, I've said this before, one of the things about this phrase, dusting off your feet, I just see somebody standing there just stomping their feet, dusting their feet off, right? Well, the Jews use that, and that's what exactly Paul's going to say when we get into Acts further on. When he gets so fed up with the Jews in the synagogue, he says, "Fine, I'm going to the Gentiles," and he dusts off his feet. That's an amazing thing, but where's the root of that? The root of that goes back to this cultural purity, this idea that whenever a Jew would travel outside the land, if they went off holy ground, if they went off the promised land, which was the land they inherited, anything outside of Judah, they were on Gentile dirt. And they'd get dirt on their shoes. And so when they would walk up to the border, they would stop and they would stomp their feet to get that Gentile dirt off their body, and then they would step on and come in. It'd be like standing on the Texas-New Mexico border when you guys came across. You had to stop, get out, stomp your feet, make sure, dust your car off, make sure you don't get any of that Texas dirt here in New Mexico. Wow. I mean, I think that's one of the greatest, you want to talk about an example of showing how culturally pure they thought they had to remain, to the point where they did not want to even bring in dirt into an area that would contaminate Jerusalem. And so that's why I've always loved when I read about Paul in the synagogue, then all of a sudden stomping his feet. Because what he's saying is, I'm bouncing the dirt off of you, from you, what you have contaminated to me, and now I'm going to go to the Gentile, which is a reverse, isn't it? Because now he's saying, and now I know he's standing in a synagogue, but think of the symbology of it. He's saying, I now have dirt from being in a synagogue, a pure place where we should be able to be considered pure, and I'm going to bounce that dirt off, stomp that off, and I'm going to go get Gentile dirt. Just think of the anger that a Jew hearing that. You just stomped off holy dirt, basically, and now you're going to go waller in the dust of the Gentiles. So I bring that up because this is important to keep that in our minds, that we look at this culturally of what's going on with this conversion. Why it's so hard for them to understand this. They're not really fully understanding. Like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, and about the purpose of the gifts and such, is that there's a lack of knowledge. There's still this growth that's going on. The prophecies are clear, but they're not as clear as we think to them to comprehend that this message was a part of the blessing to Abraham that would have blessed all nations, all breeds, all cultures, all peoples. But it hasn't gone there yet. So let's go to Cornelius. Of all the people, think of this, of all the Gentile people, it's a Roman that's going to, in his house. You telling me you couldn't find a little better, morally, culturally better group of people? And you're saying, well, that's pretty harsh. No, it's not. I mean, if you look at it from the Christian point of view, they had more respect for somebody from Ethiopia or anywhere else than these filthy Romans who are dominating and defiling and controlling God's people. They're forcing us. They have a horrible history with them. The irony is, if you go back hundreds of years, it was the Jews themselves during revolt that invited the Romans to come in and quell a civil war. And Pompey comes in and did it. And guess what? You open the door and they stayed. And they conquered. Pompey goes into the temple. So it's kind of ironic that, but then they become an anathema to them. And here, God is going to take it to the worst of the worst culturally to a Jew. And it's even worse than that, because there were within that the soldiers. I mean, it's bad enough to just know that the Roman Empire is dominating us. But what is the tip of the sword for a Jew? It's the soldiers. They have suffered immensely, cruelty with the centurions. I mean, the Roman army. And then you take, this is a leader of that house, is a centurion. The town Caesarea was named in honor by Herod, Caesar Augustus, in honor, Caesarea. Caesar. The name alone, it is a Roman city, which means that the houses and such are everything about them. This is a place of safe haven for those officials of the Romans who did not want to go out and mingle with the populace. You can imagine it's kind of like going for an American today to go to China. You probably want to kind of hang out with people that you, could understand culturally, or even Russia or somewhere. So Caesarea was this kind of safe haven for a lot of the officials for the Roman Empire. So that means as well the architecture, which will help us when we go to look at the encounter and the transition. It's kind of interesting. He is living in, Cornelius, in a very comfortable house. He's got servants, we know. It says that he has 2 that he sends, plus like an aide or somebody that he's going. Just to remind ourselves what a cohort was basically a company of 100 men, centurions would command. And this was not like the army or the military of today, where an individual in time and grade, after so long of serving, you would then go to an NCO course or a leadership course, and then you'd go through all this process of promotion and equality. No. Skip all that. It was about brutality. It was about warrior. They wanted the Navy SEAL of the Navy SEALs to run the cohort, to run their companies. And there was these horrific disciplinary actions that the Romans would inflict upon the soldiers if they failed in their duties. And it was the centurion's job to carry it out. You remember the guards who failed at Jesus' grave? It would have been the centurion who would have ordered the execution of them because they failed to keep that body in the grave. It was also, there was a process, I just had it, but it was a process where in the legions, they would go through, and to discipline the legion, they would randomly draw 1 out of 10 and kill them. It was brutal. And they only did it a couple of Caesars. The emperors would order it, and then guess who got to do that? It was the centurions. So when we think about the caliber of this man and culturally what he's lived, and by the way, there was no retirement plan really. I mean, it was like 20 to 30 years, but the lifespan of a soldier pretty much, to make it a centurion, you are the toughest of the toughest. And you've gone through a lot of battles. You have gone through a lot. And so you just think about soldiers today and the post-traumatic stress of what they've experienced in combat. And this type of combat that these men were going through was hand-to-hand, in your face, slaughtering, getting bloody type of battle. So Cornelius is a very unique, very, very unique person. Because then we find that he is somebody who fears God. And it's not just him. If you look at verse 2, it says his whole household. And I think we start to see the respect that his house has, or the power, maybe, if you thought he's brutal, but his whole house also fears God. Now, the Romans always worshiped a god. Usually it was their ancestors, and they had a little idol that they would set up, and they would always offer a portion off their meals to these idols. So it was normal. It's not a matter of it's not a problem of getting people to believe in a god. It's the type of God. So they would worship, but if you stopped offering a worship to these idols in your house, household idols they would call them, you were abandoning your family. And that's another little aspect that we forget, that Cornelius' household was used to worshiping household gods that represented their ancestors. So by them stopping and fearing God, this house is already showing, a devotion towards God. But that's not the whole deal, is it? Because we know that there's more to what he needs to know. Now, 9th hour of the day, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, there were 2 hours of the day that were primary prayer hours. We don't know that he was necessarily praying, but it seems to possibly indicate that he was. That's the hour that most of the faithful would be praying. This man does fear God, so it's very possible that it was during a prayer that he has this vision of an angel. And it scares him to death. I mean, it says, that he is terrified. He sees it, and he's afraid of what it is. I mean, it would be terrifying, wouldn't it, if you were to see that angel standing there, stared at him in terror in verse 4. And the angel tells him, everything that you've been doing is wonderful. It's coming up to God. God sees it. You've got a great respect for the Hebrew culture and Moses' law. But there's still something more. So God is honoring it. God respects what he's doing, but he identifies through this angel, there's still a little bit more that you need to know. You need to be able to do. And I think that's important when we think about it. This shows that we have people that are religious, but they're still missing it. They're not right with God. And when I say religious, when you're religious, you carry out the acts. You can show the respect. You can go to church all you want. can do all these wonderful things. You can pray to God. You can donate to money. You can do all this. And you're doing religious things that you believe you're serving God. But a lot of the religion, when it comes to this dimension, this world, is about us, our works. And we know our works don't save us, that it's faith. Faith is what saves us. Now, faith is based on a word that we understand that makes it actionable, and we take action upon it. But outside of having that right relationship with God, works are really meaningless. But it shows that God does see his works as being something that's good. I did hear this a long time ago about this idea this question. Does God hear the sinner's prayer? And some will say, no, absolutely not. And that's a question that cannot be answered that simply. You have to ask, what is the sinner asking for? And we know that in Isaiah, he talks about sin and God's inability to listen to the sinner, but it's because they're staying in sin. He's talking to the Israelites that they are praying to God, but they're living in sin. They're not repenting. And God says, no, I'm not going to answer your prayer. I'm not going to listen. I can't hear you. And that illustration where he says, is God's ear where he can't hear them because they're sinning? And so some, I think, have drawn the conclusion that, well, God doesn't listen to sinners. Well, that's wrong. I mean, this, I think, shows that God... Now, did Cornelius say, oh, Lord, bring me the word so that I can be a Christian? He didn't know, did he? So God knows what Cornelius needs. And I don't think that in his prayers he had an idea of what he was really asking for, but God provided for him because of his acts and the things that he was doing. So he says, send him to Joppa. Now, when he tells him send him to Joppa, you notice there's two Simons here. We call him Peter, but he's very specific, Luke records, that you need to go get one Simon. And it's interesting that Luke even records, he says, now send men to Joppa, bring one Simon. Oh, and it's like, they call him Peter. Why? Well, he's lodging with one Simon, a tanner. So don't get confused. Don't go down and ask for the tanner. Get the man who they also call Peter. And then he says, whose house is by the sea. And then the angel departed, and he spoke. And so he sends forward. Now, the next day, so these men are en route. They're traveling on their way to down to Joppa. So let's go ahead and pick up in 9 through 12. The next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the house about the 6th hour to pray. And he became hungry, wanting something to eat. But while they were preparing it, he fell into a trance. And he saw the heavens opened up and something like a great sheet descending, being let down by its four corners upon the earth. It were all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air. And there came a voice to him, rise, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, by no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean. And the voice came to him again a second time. What God has made clean, do not call common. This happened 3 times, and the thing was taken up at once to heaven. Now, while Peter was inwardly perplexed as to what the vision that he had seen might mean, behold, the 2 men who were sent by Cornelius, having made inquiry of Simon's house, stood at the gate, and they called out to ask whether Simon, who was called Peter, was lodging there. While Peter was pondering the vision, the Spirit said to him, behold, 3 men are looking for you. Arise and go down and accompany them without hesitation, for I have sent them. And Peter went down to the men and said, I am the one you're looking for. And they said, he asked them, what is the reason? Trying to catch up. I'm sorry, I started reading my Bible program and ignoring the slides, so if you're online trying to follow, blew right past you on that. So And they said, Cornelius, a centurion, an upright, God-fearing man who is well spoken of by the Jewish nation, was directed by a holy angel to send for you and to come to his house and to hear what you have to say. So he invited them in to be his guests. The next day he arose and he went away with them, and some of the brothers from Joppa accompanied him. So he has, at the same time, while we have the men traveling down to Joppa to go get Peter, Peter has this vision. So he's waiting for them to cook. They're cooking a meal. He goes upstairs, and I don't know, it's interesting that he's waiting for food to be prepared for them to eat. At the same time, then when he has this dream, the Lord brings forward this vision of like a sheet, 4 corners. You notice 4 corners? Interesting. How many directions are there? North, east, south, west? 4 corners. So everything, in other words, that is creatures, he's showing, saying God is trying to show him is clean, is not defiled as you consider it. Why were they defiled? Well, it was cultural. It was something that they had been taught, according to Mosaic law, that they were not to eat of these. So it was a civil requirement, law-wise, and it was also a moral requirement that they were to abstain from these type of animals. So he's getting, it's more than just about the food, though, isn't it? It's about getting him to understand what God has called clean is clean. And this is more, he's really talking about the idea of bringing the Gentiles in, preparing Peter to accept this concept. So at that same time, the men arrive, they speak up, they want to know if he's there, and then Peter's directed. You notice it's one thing to have the vision, and then Peter hear them and go down and go, "Who are you?" And then they say, "Oh, well, our boss, he sent us down because he had a vision from an angel, and he is a religious man." And I think that Peter would have paused. He would have, well, wait a minute, a Roman, a centurion, a Gentile. So the Lord has to kind of help him bridge that, push him a little bit, not only with a vision, but now saying, you need to go with him. So he says, they describe him. They try to help out. Cornelius is a God-fearing man. He's well spoken of. And so he invites him in the house. Now, so let's start to talk a little bit about this clean, unclean, and Peter's statement. The vision is very clearly showing that you need to open up and understand that what God is now declaring clean is clean. But before it was, okay, Peter, you're right. And Peter very boldly says, he says to God, "No, I'm not eating that." That sounds like a Peter, doesn't it? That is Peter. "No, Lord, you're not going to go to Jerusalem. Lord, can I get out and walk on the water?" It's like just Peter. Man, that is so Peter-esque. When the Lord tells you that, here, take, kill, and eat, and he goes, "No, I'm not going to eat." It's like, good old Peter. You're still the same Peter. So it took 3 visions. Now, what's 3? 3 is very important, right? It's a complete message, in other words. Look. But then it still took God saying, you still need to go with them when these guys come down. Where's Peter staying? He's in Joppa. He's staying with the disciple. Remember, these disciples were Jews who have become Christians. So he's still showing that integrity of culture and not defiling himself with Gentiles. But there's another thing. What's the job of this man? Of Simon? What's he doing? He's a tanner. What do tanners do? Well, they skin pigs. They skin things with animals to make leather. So he, in his job alone, is dealing and handling with probably, because a lot of the animals that he would be tanning for leather and clothes and such would be unclean animals. And so, okay, let's just say, how well do we think that Peter knew this Simon? Maybe he knew him well. Maybe this man remained pure. Maybe there was something going on. But there's almost like a little bit of a segue of, here he is staying at this house of this man who's skinning all these animals. and there's high probability some of those were unclean themselves. And then he has this meal, dreamed this vision of animals about clean, unclean, and God is really working, in other words, trying to get him to go. So he does travel with him. In verse 25 through 28, we'll pick up there. When Peter entered, Cornelius met him, and he fell down at his feet, and he worshipped him. But Peter lifted him up, saying, "Stand up, I too am a man." And as he talked with him, he went in, and he found many persons gathered. And he said to them, "You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with any or to visit anyone of another nation. But God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without objection. I asked why you sent for me. And Cornelius said, 4 days ago, about this hour, I was praying in my house in the 9th hour, and behold, a man stood before me in bright clothing and said, 'Cornelius, your prayer has been heard, and your alms have been remembered before God. Send therefore to Joppa and ask for Simon, who is called Peter. He is lodging in the house of Simon, a tanner, by the sea. So I sent for you at once, and you have been kind enough to come. Now, therefore, we are all here in the presence of God to hear all that you have been commanded before the Lord.'" So, Peter, first off, he takes witnesses with him. He takes some of the disciples. One of the things is you need to have 2 witnesses. That's the Jewish custom, so he brings them with him. And as they arrive, Cornelius is there. And what is interesting is the way that Cornelius greets him is with high respect. He falls down, and he fall down at his feet, verse 25, and he worshiped him. And Peter lifted him up, and he said, "Stand up, I too am a man." What is that? Anybody, does this ring, ding, 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 any like alarms or something about worshiping Peter? When Peter was alive, in other words, he would not permit people to worship him. But we have a lot of worship with statues. As a matter of fact, in the Vatican area, there is a statue of Peter, and he has so many people that come up, bow down, and kiss his feet, that over the hundreds of years, they've had to repair that statue and change his feet because of the saliva. I know it sounds nasty. From the kissing of the feet of the thousands of people over the hundreds of years coming down, bowing down to Peter's feet and kissing in that statue, that I'm sorry, this verse just, pow, hits me in the head. It's like, did they I almost want to go to Rome and put this verse right below it. Say, hey, Cornelius tried to worship him, and he says, "Get up, I'm just a man just like you." And one of the things as he's talking, and he went in, this is where he starts from the courtyard. I was talking about the way the houses were. As they come in, you have then Peter seeing this crowd that is gathered around, and the idea, then he defends. He becomes a little uncomfortable, doesn't he? I mean, he becomes very uncomfortable, and then he states in 28, "You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate, have friends, in other words, or even to come and visit you." Was that necessary? Why was that needful at all? I mean, I can't ever imagine going to a Bible study into somebody's house that was a murderer or a rapist or some very defiled person and walk into their house and go, "You know that as a Christian, I'm not supposed to associate with or even visit somebody of your little stature." Because that's what he just did to Cornelius. It just almost buzzkilled the whole idea of him being able to now teach them. Peter's very uncomfortable. Look how much it's taken. The vision, It's taken the Lord pushing him in, him traveling, bringing witnesses. Peter's not just going in for this. The Lord's going to have to do more, and we know he does. We're going to go and stop there because we're going to look in more detail next week on the message and what transpires with it. I think that's important. It needs more time than we have this morning. So, God bless. I hope you can make it down at 10:45 to worship with us. Also this afternoon at 4 p.m. We're live streaming all of this, and then 6 for Bible study on Wednesday. So hope to see you soon. God bless.